find it on our reading today, verses 1 and 4 of chapter 1, on page 1860. A few brief comments first. These first 4 verses, they set the tone for the whole letter. The whole Old Testament revelation came in bits and pieces at various times and in different places. And long ago, the writer says, God spoke to our ancestors, but in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son. So right off the top, we have this long story. From its first inklings in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 to the new creation in Revelation chapter 21, and we're undone by the magnificence of this revelation, this brilliance, and this long-suffering patience of God. And it's a long way before we ever get to Jesus. We have all these writings, all these sayings, these poetic and lyrical writings, this mysterious and mystical, the romance and happenstance, the harrowing adventures and vicious villains along the way, promises made and promises waylaid, battles fought and won and waged and lost, epic failures and unfathomable forgiveness, heroic underdogs and men overboard. And just read Revelation chapter 12, capturing in Tolkien-like fashion how the great fiery red dragon appears to swallow the woman about to give birth, to put the master plan at risk, the only plan that would ever work, the only way to save humanity. And oh no, all is lost, and only it's never at risk at all, for it is done before it is begun. And there is this baby, a baby born in the same way as every human, and is a son of the Most High, God in flesh, born of a virgin. Helpless babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger, come to save the world. The full expression of God's wisdom. Jesus, superior in every way to all revelation that had come before, the actual essential being of God himself. The story begins in Genesis, ends in Revelation, with a kingdom without end. It's our story. And so we sing, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, Glory to the Newborn King. Hebrews chapter 1. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many ways and in various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. He is the reflection of God's glory, the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. And when he made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Let's pray. God, as we speak, these words are spoken, and as we hear them, we ask that you would fill them with your voice, that you would speak and we would hear, and thereby be made new. Amen. In John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, He gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The Word of God for the people of God. So when I was a boy, I took Santa very seriously. I remember sweeping the living room floor on Christmas Eve because I didn't want to be on Santa's naughty list. And I had some concern about that. Having set fire to the radiator in our bedroom, trying to drive out the wolves that were there in our imaginations, saving everybody from the wolves, and we got in trouble for it. Somehow I ended up on the naughty list. And you know how Santa is. He watches us all the time to see if we're naughty or if we're good. Now, I know I must have swept the floor many times since that one night, but in my memory, this is the only one that I recall. So obviously it had a lot of meaning for me. The sweet, bearded old man sometimes looks a little bit scary with his all-knowing eye. And that was my image. That was my image of God too. Yeah. The policeman, constantly watching over every move to see if we're good or not, to see if we're worth rewarding with a gift, or if he should instead stick us with, you should have done better, lump of coal. On the other hand, the Christmas gospel is this. While we were yet naughty, God took flesh and gave us the gift of himself. Isaiah gives us a name for this child. He's called Emmanuel. And that sounds wonderful, and it's God coming near to be with us, but it's also a little bit scary because God is a consuming fire, and so this is dangerous too. And I just knew that there were times, when I was on that naughty list, and I'd better be careful. I'd better watch out. But the Christmas story is not the Santa story. Emmanuel comes to be with us, to live among us, to rescue us. Christmas says, whoever you are, from wherever you have come, whatever the reasons that brought you here, welcome. Peace was announced to the shepherds prior to any conditions being made of them. Now you might be, I know all of you all are, and every Sunday regular listening for bits of sermons you've already heard. But the welcome is for you as well. And maybe your parents, the parents aren't here, but maybe your parents amped up kids, amped up with sugar in their veins and toys scattered about the house. Meanwhile, you're already thinking about decorations being put away, the gifts to be returned, the bills to be paid, and going back to work on Monday. To you too is the gospel. You're welcome. Come. You might be a fingers-crossed skeptic thinking you're the only one here this morning with more questions than clarity about this gospel story. The welcome is for you. You might be depressed, feel no joy at all. And that's okay, because the joy of Christmas isn't about you, though it is for you. It's about something that has happened outside of you. So welcome. Maybe you yelled at your wife on Christmas morning. Welcome. Maybe you're secretly relieved your sister won't be coming this year or didn't come this year. Welcome. Maybe you're giddy with spite that your ex-husband won't see the kids this holiday. Welcome. Maybe you're terrified that you can't make it through another Christmas on the wagon. We are still on Christmas. Welcome. Maybe you can't believe to see your Elizabeth Warren loving neighbor here this morning. Welcome. Maybe you can't believe your Trump loving neighbor is here this morning. welcome. Today, all of you are as welcomed as the next person, because contrary to what you may have heard, Christianity is not a club of good, pious, religious, moral people making their way up to God. Christianity is about God coming down in Jesus Christ to people like us, to people whose goodness is inconsistent, to people whose piety is imperfect, to people whose morality is too often self-serving and convenient, and whose faith is unreliable. All of us. We're all guests this morning of the God who has come down to us in the flesh to dwell among us. We are welcomed as God's guests just as we are. I have a Christmas story for you. In the 1970s, a psychology student at Bowdoin College, Ellen Baxter, set out to discover a more humane way to treat the mentally ill. As an undergraduate, she made her way onto a psychiatric ward. She observed how the patients were treated. And she left convinced that American culture's obsession with improving and fixing and changing ourselves had infected the mental health system, too. We're stuck on recovery, she said. But when you fail to deal with people as they are, when you're dead set determined to fix them and to change them, you end up changing them for the worse because you erode their humanity, she said. Her research through old medical journals and psychology articles led her to a modest little village in Belgium named Heel. According to those dusty journals, Heel had made the highest success rate of recovery for the mentally ill. And at the center was a church dedicated to Saint Dymphna, who was martyred in Heel in the 7th century. Saint Dymphna is the patron saint of the mentally ill, which is why beginning in the 8th century, Heel became a pilgrimage declaration for the mentally ill people. 5 centuries later, starting in the 13th century, the residents of Heel began boarding those pilgrims into their homes. Heel became a place where everyday people, farmers, bartenders, blacksmiths, waitresses, welcomed insane strangers into their homes. No questions asked, just as they were, no matter the risks, welcomed them like they would have a beloved aunt or uncle. And by the 19th century, this practice of hospitality earned Heel the nickname Paradise for the Insane. And by the turn of the 20th century, this Christian practice became a public system, where doctors place patients into the homes of hosts who have no idea what the diagnosis of their guests bring with them. But by 1930s, over a quarter of all the residents of Heel were mentally ill, about 10,000 people. According to Ellen, the average length of stay for a guest with a host family, and notice they call them guests, not patients, was 28.5 years. Wow, it's mind-blowing. Meanwhile, a third of all the guests stay with the same host family for almost 50 years. They take these broken, crazy guests into their home, and they live with them, and they die with them. Ellen, she won a grant fellowship to spend a year studying in Heel, and she describes going from house to house, interviewing host families, asking them the same questions always, and always getting the same answers. Did you find it to be a burden? No. Do you find it painful? No, it's just life, a bus driver told her. Do you find it tiring? No. And over again, she heard these same responses from the host families. Host families shrugging their shoulders and replying that crazy is just a part of normal life. It made her wonder, she said, if I had stumbled upon a race of angels. And she didn't understand, though. She didn't understand why the citizens of Heel were so successful at rehabilitating these guests, and more successful than modern medicine. And these are people with serious mental illnesses, until she met the Buttons guy, The buttons guy helped her understand. A middle-aged man, a boarder, who every single day would twist all the buttons off his shirt, nervously twisting them off, and every single day and every single night his host mother would sew all the buttons back onto the buttons guy's shirt, and every day he twists them off, and every night she sews them back on. And what a waste of time it was, Ellen said, when she first heard the story describing what she did, the host mom, in order to live with a buttons guy. You should sew the buttons back on with fishing line, she said, so that he can't twist them off, she said. And the host mom reacted with offense. No, that's the worst thing you could do. This man needs to twist off those buttons. It helps him to twist the buttons off every day. You don't understand, the host mom explained. In order to accept mentally ill people into your home, you first have to accept what they're doing. You have to accept their oddness and their idiosyncrasies. You've got to let them take their buttons off. Being with them is the first step in being able to do anything for them. And that's when Ellen Baxter stumbled upon what she calls the solution of no solution. Once she knew what to look for and heal, she said she saw it everywhere, practiced from house to house. What freed guests for healing and rehabilitation was the way their hosts refused to treat them as problems to be fixed. Instead, they just welcomed them into their homes to share life with them. A host's acceptance of their guests without any expectation of changing them is in itself the elixir with the power to change them. Ellen Baxter calls what she found in the homes of Kiel the strange healing power of not trying to fix the problem. In the church, we have always had a name for it. We call it grace. It's why we call this story that gives us Christ gospel. It's the good news. John doesn't give the Christmas story the way Matthew, Mark, and Matthew or Luke tell it. John doesn't mention Caesar or a star over the city or a manger or Joseph or Mary. John gives us this Christmas story by telling you that the Word, which spoke the stars into the sky, became flesh and dwelled among us. The law, God's expectations for you, for who you should be and what you should do and how you should change and fix yourself, came through Moses. But the strange healing power of not trying to fix the problem has come through Jesus Christ. The Word became flesh and lived among us, John says. And the word John uses there for word is logos. It's the same word the Old Testament uses for the tabernacle, this makeshift tent the Israelites pitched when they wandered through the wilderness. As God's people journey for 40 years from slavery into Egypt into the freedom of the promised land, God journeys with them in the tabernacle. And it's the same word. The same word the Bible uses to describe the 10 words of God. The commandments sealed inside the ark. It's the word the Bible uses when Moses hides himself in a cleft of the rock in order to catch a glimpse of God's glory. And it's the word the Old Testament uses for the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the place Jesus will call his Father's house, the Holy of Holies where God resided among his people, heaven come to earth. The Word was where God met the man. But no one could meet God there at the curtain without making some kind of ritual practice of purification. We were all too soiled by sin, the Bible says, even to come close, let alone be welcomed into the place where God was, where God lives. Only the high priest of Israel, on behalf of all his people, could venture near. But even the high priest first needed to be made acceptable and cleansed and purified by ritual. The high priest first needed to fix his own problem through ritual purification, and only then did the high priest dare to come near to God's home. Mary's womb is the Holy of Holies. And in her baby, the Word become flesh and lived among us. John tells us in his Christmas story this Word. And there is here in this story no high priest mediating between us and the God. There is no requirement to render you acceptable first before this God. Alan Baxter describes the guest she met in Hale, whose name was Des. Des suffered from terrors every night. Bloodthirsty lions were about to pounce through the walls to eat him, and it didn't work to tell him the lions weren't really there. It didn't work to try to convince him that he should change and not be afraid. His host, Tony, explained. Instead, every night, Tony and her husband would rush outside, banging pots and pans, roaring like lions themselves to scare the lions away. And that worked every time. Tony explained. He could rest, and then eventually one day, Des wasn't afraid of the lions anymore. And then one day, the lions weren't there anymore. But this is important, making him unafraid of the lions, curing him of his terrors, was not our goal, she said. Our goal was simply to welcome Des into our home just as he was, to share our life with him. Now, maybe you don't twist the buttons off your shirt day after day. You might not think bloodthirsty lions are about to leap out the walls to eat you, but we all suffer from delusions. We all hear voices in our heads. Some of you may be crazy enough to think that you're basically a good person, and therefore you don't need Mary's boy to live for you or the life of perfect faithfulness that God requires of you. Some of us could be insane enough to actually think the sins we've sinned are somehow too great for Jesus to have forgotten them forever in his grave. And maybe some of you just might be deluded enough to think that your chronic misdeeds, resentments and jealousies, your broken relationships and bitter strings of regret somehow put you beyond God's mercy. Now that's just crazy. Some of you might actually think that because you tweet the right opinion or post the right position on Facebook that you're righteous. Meanwhile, some of you really think that you're the only person here who doesn't have it all together. You might think you're the only person here whose family is a disaster or whose marriage is a train wreck. Or you're the only person here who doesn't believe most of what I've preached, and therefore it doesn't apply to you. We all suffer from delusions. We all hear voices in our heads, voices telling us we're unlovely or unlovable, voices that tell us we're inadequate or unforgivable, voices that never tire of pointing out all the ways we fall short of a standard that exists only in our heads. Voices never quite go away, quit their whispering that the gospel news is too good to be true. But what John wants you to see is that Jesus Christ, in Jesus, in the humanity of God, God has welcomed you into his home. This is paradise for the insane. What the church calls incarnation, God has taken you into himself, not as a patient to be changed and fixed, but as a guest to be welcomed. God has welcomed you into the home that is Christ's body and wrapped you in the gift of Christ's own perfect righteousness to live and die with you without any expectation or need for you first to be fixed. And in Jesus Christ, God dwells with us, sewing our buttons, as we sew our buttons back on and banging away at our very real nightmares until all is calm and bright and we can rest. John, in this Christmas story, calls all of this grace. And even an unbeliever like Elizabeth Baxter can testify to its strange power to heal. And this is our story. It belongs to us. It's why we say Merry Christmas. Amen. And we, using the words given to us, we